people ask me, after I won the Goldman Prize, how did my life change? How did I think differently? And what I learned from the very first moment that I met the other prize recipients was, even though we were from 5 different continents and an island nation, and we were fighting battles as diverse as palm oil deforestation, coal mines, power plants, toxic waste dumps, that there was a common thread through all of our stories. Each one of us helped our communities to stand up to powerful forces and achieve a significant victory. While the specifics of each fight were different, we were all unwilling to accept the status quo. We were all unwilling to be told to be quiet, to sit down, to play by the rules, to not get in the way of progress, and to simply accept the destruction of our communities as inevitable. Each and every one of us could also have been dismissed as NIMBY, not in my backyard. But our planet is our backyard. My backyard, your backyard, our front yards, where we work, where we play, that's the environment. The environment is not somehow outside of us, somewhere else, someplace we just go and visit on special occasions. Calling someone NIMBY implies that they are selfish and thoughtless and unconcerned about the larger world, and willing to put their own self-interest ahead of what is best for the community and the rest of the world. But that is not an accurate description of environmental activists. It is, however, an accurate description of those who would destroy another person's backyard, of those who would destroy a community's heritage, simply because they can make money. So while I am here tonight to share one story, that of New Yorkers standing up and fighting fracking, the common thread weaves through that story, and it weaves through stories untold and yet undescribed. So what this is really about is challenging the status quo, challenging the system, and not backing down, even when you're under withering attack. So turning to New York. Powerful economic forces are spending millions of dollars trying to convince people that there is a shale gas revolution underway in America. Well, fracking is causing a revolution, but it is not the one that you're reading about and seeing in the gas companies' blue sky commercials. The real shale gas revolution is a revolt. It is a revolt against a fossil fuel industry concerned first and foremost with maintaining its ability to pursue profits and maintaining a business model that are necessarily dependent upon polluting our common public resources. The battlefields of the real shale gas revolution extend across my country, from California to New York and to places in between. The soldiers in these battles are everyday people, workers, students, retirees, who are unwilling to accept the thesis that if we don't want fracking in our communities, then we should move. The command centers of the real shale gas revolution are in living rooms and kitchens, community centers, and town halls. And it was in just such a town hall where in 2009, I first learned about fracking, and I first enlisted as a soldier in this fight. And I'm here tonight to bring you a from the front lines report of how ordinary people in New York State have beaten back entrenched business interests that were intent on fracking our communities, our farms, our forests, our fields, and everywhere else that they saw fit. Like many people, before fracking threatened my community, I knew very little about it. But after I attended my first meeting and I saw what fracking really did to people, what it really did to the landscape, I couldn't get the images out of my head. I saw acres and acres of forest destroyed for well pads, pipelines, and drilling staging areas. I saw hundreds and hundreds of heavy trucks tearing up local roads with carrying immense quantities, millions and millions of gallons of fresh water, not to mention an incredible amount of hazardous chemicals to and from these drill sites. I saw scores of fracking pumps belching diesel as they blasted millions of gallons of their toxic fracking brew down into the earth. I saw gargantuan open lagoons filled with fracking waste, simply left to evaporate into the atmosphere. All of those dangerous chemicals that were in there, just into the atmosphere. I saw fracking next to homes, next to schools, and next to places where we grew our food. And I learned that each fracking well, each job of a fracked well, irrevocably destroys, contaminates, permanently pollutes 5 million to 8 million gallons of water for each frack job. So given all of that, it might come as a surprise that that wasn't the single worst thing that I learned that night. The worst thing that I heard that night was that there was no way to stop this. Fracking was coming, and it was going to happen anywhere and everywhere that the industry wanted it to happen. We were told the frackers were already in Pennsylvania, the state to the south of us, and that they were determined to roll into New York next, and we couldn't stop them. We were told there was no way to protect our children, no way to protect our health, no way to protect the sanctity and the beauty of the places where we lived and called home. Government regulators, attorneys throughout our state, and even the big environmental groups unanimously agreed there was nothing anyone could do. Fracking was coming, it was inevitable. It would invade our community, and it would literally shatter the bedrock of our towns. I was astounded and horrified, and I put everything else in my life aside to immerse myself in research, to learn as much as I could about fracking and how the law might be used to defend against these impacts. As I dug deeper, I learned about many cases of water pollution associated with the process of drilling and operating shale gas wells. Industry publicly denies that their operations contaminate water, but at the same time, they quietly are entering into settlement agreements with people who live near gas drilling operations and whose water has gone bad, or whose water now contains so much methane that it can be lit on fire. You don't hear much about these settlement agreements, though, because the gas drilling companies insist that the victims sign non-disclosure agreements, confidentiality agreements, as a condition to their victims receiving fresh water supplies or being relocated. The fossil fuel industry seems to believe that it is the most important industry on our planet and that its rights to profit trump everything else, including our rights to health and to safety. For many decades, the fossil fuel industry has fought hard and has been remarkably successful in protecting their ability to reap fantastically large profits by selling, extracting, and burning carbon. The industry has paid their lobbyists handsomely to ensure that fracking is explicitly exempted from almost all of our federal environmental laws in America. And my home state of New York, like many other states, has a law that says that local governments are prohibited from regulating the oil and gas industry. The more I learned about fracking and its negative health and environmental impacts, the more determined I became to find a way for people to fight back. My husband, David, who's also a lawyer, had enlisted in the cause beside me, and by the summer of 2010, we had found a promising approach. We concluded that even though our state law prohibited local governments from regulating the industry, that fact did not mean that local governments had lost the right to make local land use decisions. So while the state law thought, and was probably right, that most of our local elected officials didn't have the technical qualifications to regulate drilling operations, that didn't mean that the drillers somehow had the right to frack anywhere and everywhere they wanted, whether or not people lived nearby, went to school, or grew food. When we first shared our opinion that municipal governments had this right to locally ban fracking, the meeting participants were elated. This was the first ray of hope for many after being told for so long that fracking was coming and that federal and state laws provided that the gas companies' rights to profit took priority over everything else. News of the prospect of using local laws to protect communities spread quickly from town to town, and people fanned out and began talking to their neighbors and asking them if they would support going to their local officials and asking for a ban on fracking. It turned out almost everyone appreciated being asked their opinion, and very large majorities were adamant that they thought fracking should be banned. Across upstate New York, people from all walks of life, men and women, young and old, liberal and conservative, came together to fight for their homes, their way of life, and for our one planet. Some had been activists their whole lives. Others, like me, had never been involved in any cause. Groups of concerned citizens began begging their town boards to take proactive action and protect them. And as word spread of this powerful weapon in the arsenal of community defense, concerned people from all over our state clamored for more information on how they could pass these local bans. So my husband and I decided to form a nonprofit law firm, Community Environmental Defense Council, to provide no-cost legal help to these communities. We began drafting protective laws during the day and giving educational programs during the evening, often holding the educational components on Sunday evenings and Saturdays because our weekdays were so full of meetings with town boards, and people were so desperate for this information that they were willing to schedule their town board meetings on Sundays. Initially, industry scoffed at the local ban movement, deriding concerned citizens as tree huggers and assuring anyone who would listen that local bans were invalid, useless, and a waste of people's time. But as the local ban movement gained steam, industry did become increasingly concerned, and they responded by intensifying their claims that there had never been a single case in the history of gas drilling where our water supplies had been contaminated. And they told us that fracking inevitably created fantastic and stupendous numbers of new jobs. When those claims were easily debunked and the local ban movement continued full speed ahead, industry shifted into attack mode. They used the internet to attempt to discredit my reputation and my husband's reputation as lawyers, and to spread lies about the intellect and motivation of the people who opposed fracking. When that approach didn't work, they publicly threatened to bring lawsuits against any town that dared to pass a ban, and they promised that these towns would be bankrupted. In some cases, they even threatened to sue single local officials personally because they had voted for or were considering voting for a ban. But even in the face of all of these attacks and the threats of lawsuits, town after town stood their ground and enacted laws banning fracking. Ultimately, unwilling to accept the prospect of any community-based limitations on their pursuit of profits, in 2011, the industry did sue 2 of the towns. At this point, industry's public relations machine kicked into overdrive, and they relentlessly trumpeted the filing of these lawsuits, guaranteeing that industry would win and that the towns would have to pay millions and millions of dollars in damages to fracking interests. And they promised the very same fate to any other town that had the audacity to pass a ban. These lawsuits have traveled through our judicial system for the last 3 or so years, and at every turn, the courts have ruled in favor of the rights of communities to ban fracking. This past June, these victories were cemented when our state's highest court unequivocally upheld the right of communities to ban fracking. And at last count, almost 200 local communities have passed protective laws over the last several years. And this is in the face of industry's efforts, nonstop efforts to shut this movement down. Most of these laws are based on our model, and the rest many of the rest are, we worked on a lot of the laws. It is our hope that this revolution in New York against fracking will help to move the world away from dependence and subservience on powerful economic interests, and one step closer to becoming more and more, and moving away from fossil fuel interests and our use of fossil fuels. Already, a community-based movement is circling the globe. And we can win the battle. We can leave a healthy planet to our children, but only if we act now. There's no simple solution to the complex problems of climate change, but it's important to keep in mind why this problem exists in the first place. Because we have burned so much fossil fuel. And that explains why the industry is spending millions and millions of dollars funding those who deny climate change, and is trying to convince us that their 19th century technology, burning methane, is somehow revolutionary. This makes sense because, after all, seriously addressing climate change is literally an existential threat to many entrenched economic interests. So please, don't be afraid to stand your ground. Don't be afraid to be called a NIMBY. Don't follow the rules and sit quietly by as your communities and our planet hangs in the balance. Refuse to sacrifice your communities and insist upon your right to leave your children and your children's children a healthy planet. Thank you.